They said humanity was fragile, a species too small, too young, too reckless to survive the cold judgment of the stars. Empires laughed when they spoke of us, calling Earth a backwater, a mistake, a dying ember. And for a time, maybe they were right. We had no grand fleets, no shining worlds, no allies, only broken ships, dwindling colonies, and a stubborn will that refused to die. When the void came for us, when an empire of shadows closed its jaws, others turned away. No council would answer our cries, no aid would come. Humanity was meant to vanish, nameless, forgotten, erased. But in the silence of despair, something stirred. From the blackness between the stars came a howl, not of surrender, not of fear, but of fire. A warship, scarred and furious, tore through the darkness. Every cannon has a heartbeat. Every blast is a scream of defiance. It was not salvation. It was not mercy. It was humanity roaring into the abyss, reminding the galaxy that prey can become predators. Because when all hope is gone, when the void swallows the last light, only one truth remains. If this is what humanity does when it is weak, what will happen when we are strong? Pause, then low, commanding tone. If that question sent shivers down your spine, like this story, subscribe, and join the fire of humanity's legacy. The colony of Caloran Reach was quiet at dawn. Sunlight spilled across the jagged cliffs, painting the sky in pale amber while the ocean stretched like endless glass. The settlement clung to the coast, just a scattering of domes, steel towers, and thin defense walls that seemed more ceremonial than real. To its people it was home. Children chased each other along the docks, their laughter echoing over the water. Farmers guided autonomous, harvesters through fields of wheat that bent gently in the coastal winds. Traders unloaded crates of supplies from an aging shuttle, bartering with voices that rose and fell like a familiar song. It was fragile, yes. Rust showed on the steel. Supplies ran thin some weeks. Power grids flickered when storms struck. But for humanity, spread thin, scattered on the edges of an uncaring galaxy. Fragility was life, and fragility did not mean weakness. In the center of the colony, Captain Elias Vare walked slowly along the outer wall. His uniform was worn, boots scuffed from years of service. He was no longer the sharp soldier he had once been. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His back ached from old injuries, but his eyes still carried that steady fire. He stopped at the top of the wall and looked out over the horizon, as if searching for something just beyond sight. His daughter, Lyra, ran up beside him, barely 12, still clutching a half-repaired drone she tinkered with every day. "Do you think the ships will come today?" she asked. Elias smiled faintly, though the lines of worry etched deep across his face never eased. "Supply ships are late. They're always late. But they'll come. They always do." She frowned, holding the drone close. "Not supply ships. The other kind." Elias froze for a heartbeat. The wind whistled faintly along the wall. He forced his voice to stay calm. "You've been listening to the bunkhouse talk again. They say the aliens are getting closer. That they burned the Helion colony. That they won't stop." Her words trembled. Not with fear, at least not only fear, but with the sharp intuition of a child who saw more than adults believed. Elias put his hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me. Our people, we've always been surrounded by storms, by hunger, by enemies stronger than us. But we endure, we adapt. That's who we are." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the sky. That night the settlement gathered in the central dome. Families shared bread, traded stories, and sang the old Earth songs, faded echoes of a world most had never seen. The dome was warm with laughter, but underneath it ran a current of unease. Every trader brought whispers of attacks. Whole outposts erased. No one knew how far the shadows stretched. When the winds died down and the singing faded, Elias stood by the observation window staring into the stars. They glittered coldly, endless and beautiful, but something in them felt wrong. Too silent, too watchful. He thought of the ships he had seen in his youth, alien. Vessels the size of mountains, engines burning like suns. He thought of their arrogance, their cruelty. He thought of how small humanity had looked beside them, fragile, breakable. And yet he remembered the howl. Years ago, during the first skirmishes, a lone human destroyer had refused to retreat. Surrounded, crippled, it had screamed through the void with every weapon blazing. Its howl had shaken the galaxy's silence, defiance written in fire. That story had carried across every colony, whispered in bunkers and sung in secret halls. Some dismissed it as a myth, but Elias knew it was real. He had seen the wreckage with his own eyes. Now, standing beneath the stars, he wondered if the galaxy would hear another howl before it was too late. Behind him, Lyra had fallen asleep in her chair, the broken drone still clutched against her chest. Elias watched her, the way her small chest rose and fell with steady breaths. She was fragile, but she was also hopeful, and in that quiet, almost sacred moment, the alarm screamed. The stars above were no longer silent. They burned with movement, with shadows, with the approach of something vast and merciless. The storm had come. If this pulls you into their fragile world, stay with me, because the storm about to fall will test humanity like never before. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment the void itself howls. They came to a verdict, not a battle. Not a negotiation, an execution. Whole cities vanished under a single sweep of light. Skylines folded like paper. Oceans boiled where orbital cannons struck. And the nights were filled with the sound of things burning that had names. The alien armada did not encircle us to starve us or to blockade. It unmade us. Ships collapsed into themselves. Satellites winked out. Fields that had fed millions turned to ash in an instant. The magnitude of it was simple and awful. We were small, and they were endless. Fear arrived first as a physical thing. It lived in the throat. It sat in the bones of children who had never seen stars up close. It sounded in alarm sirens that no longer meant safety. Command bunkers filled with maps smeared with coffee and blood. Councils argued until their voices were raw, then stopped, because arguing felt like bargaining with a storm. People learned the language of loss, where to bury, how to ration, when to stay silent, and when to make a run for it. Trust frayed. Radios went dark one by one. The galaxy that had promised trade and treaties became a ledger of absences. And the enemy, cold, precise, brutal, showed no mercy. Their ships moved like teeth closing. Their tactics were not only military but psychological. They carved messages into the moons, left survivors in a field of glass as warnings, and broadcast a looping, insectile hymn that made even the bravest men flinch. When they captured a settlement, they did not merely conquer it. They rearranged its memory. Reports trickled in of people found hollowed out, eyes fixed on some unseen horizon, fingers scorched from holding on to dying children. They experimented with gravity like a child breaking toys. They harvested whole atmospheres and left planets thin and gray. We lost. Often, we lost enough that defeat became a reasonable plan. Outposts surrendered to buy time. Convoys turned around because the route ahead was an open maw. Pilots who had once been heroes were living on the raw calculus of survival. Which ship to burn so the others might run? Which station to jettison so at least some children lived? The weight of it made men quiet. It made women steel their faces and do what had to be done. It made entire generations learn to sleep with one eye open. But fear mutated into something else. Woven into the terror was anger. Not the clean, glorious anger of epics, but a gritty, personal fury. It began in small ways. A scavenged railgun welded into a fishing trawler, a mining rig rigged to explode on command, children learning to patch wounds with tape and stubbornness. Saboteurs slipped micro-explosive charges into alien supply lines and celebrated in basements, as if a bottle of tea had been given back to them. The anger was born from the catalog of losses. It had names: Ash's street that was ash, Commander Rel's brother, the school with the mural that had been blasted away. People stopped praying to be saved and started praying to be remembered. To matter in the ledger, resistance took shape like scars. It was not glorious at first. It was dirty and dull and smelled of oil and cold iron. Civilians became fighters, because there was no choice. A baker learned how to thread a wire into a detonator. A teacher learned signal jamming from a ragged radio engineer. Old men and young girls shared watch shifts over anti-aircraft guns cobbled from wreckage. They struck where they could, a refueling depot in the dead of a planet's winter, a scouting probe as it blinked at a refugee convoy, a small carrier as it shed drones. Each hit was a sentence scribbled in the enemy's book of certainty. You are not invincible. But the cost was always counted in children who would never laugh again, and in mothers who learned to fold themselves around other people's sorrow. With each victory came a price, an outpost that blew a cruiser's fuel stores could not afford to hide afterward. Retaliation was swift and surgical. Entire neighborhoods turned into coordinates on a targeting system. The enemy escalated. If we burned a supply line, they would hollow out the moon. If we took a fighter in a ragged raid, they unleashed a cloud of microdrones that chased survivors through ruined alleys. until no one moved. It felt as if each act of defiance was answered with a calculus of cruelty designed to make defiance seem foolish. Yet defiance grew teeth. It learned to be clever. We stopped meeting the Armada on the Armada's terms and began to meet it in caches and shadows. Small units practiced vanishing. Convoys learned that silence was armor. They moved in silence and left behind false trails and broken comms that sang of dead ends. Pilots flew with their guts and a prayer, and the knowledge that losing a fighter could buy a colony another sunrise. Stories of cunning spread faster than the enemy's propaganda. A fishing vessel that rammed a drone carrier and detonated its hull. A group of miners who rerouted a refinery's coolant into the alien docking clamps and watched the clamps seize and snap. These were not Empire-level victories. They were acts of spite and necessity stitched into legend. Emotion roared louder. Fear still lived in the corners, but anger stoked it into a furnace. People who had been husks began to breathe rebellion. They painted slogans in places the aliens could not ignore, scratched defiance into the inner walls of cave shelters, hung toys on ruined pylons as markers, sang songs into radios that the enemy could not jam. The sound of those songs carried farther than any distress call a message that the human spirit was not an item to be cataloged and shelved. Communities that had barely known each other found ways to trade air, filters and batteries, to swap parts and stories. The smallest kindnesses turned into strategies. The war, once a series of tactical maneuvers, became a mosaic of bravery. And then came the nights when hope curled up and died again. An ambush that had worked 100 times failed because the enemy adapted. A convoy that was supposed to slip through a ridge was caught in a crossfire that lit the sky like a second sunrise. We did not win every raid. We could not. For every small victory there was a ledger of loss. The brutality made myth of our triumphs. Because each one was bought with a price we could never fully repay. Just when the raids and counterstrikes had carved the war into a bitter, grinding rhythm, when the maps were full of burned-off corners and the names of towns were no longer whispered but chanted in remembrance, the sensors picked up something impossible. A signature that did not fit the enemy's pattern. An object crawling out from deeper black than any of our charts had mapped. Instruments that had been silent for months crackled. Voices that had gone thin with disbelief leaned closer to their consoles. It was not a rescue. It was not a plea. It was a shape, and it made the void answer. If you feel the knot in your chest tightening, if you would stand and fight beside them, drop a comment right now. Hit subscribe. More of humanity's defiance is coming. The void split open. Out of the silence came a shadow. No, a scar. A warship, human-forged, battered from 100 nameless battles. Its hull etched with wounds like the body of an old soldier who refused to fall. The aliens faltered. For the first time since the siege began, their formations rippled. The hymn they broadcast across the stars wavered, distorted. In their language it meant only one thing: impossible. The humans on the ground did not cheer, not yet. They watched, breathless, as the lone vessel faced a fleet that had crushed empires. One warship against hundreds, a candle against a storm. But then the howl came. Not a sound in the air, but a vibration that shook the bones of the planet. A roar carried on engines driven past their limits. A scream of steel and defiance. Humanity had not sent a fleet. Humanity had sent fury itself. The first salvo tore across the void. Cannons lit the black with fire brighter than dawn. Alien cruisers recoiled as shields flared and failed. Fighters scrambled, swarming like hornets. But the warship danced, weaving through trajectories with the precision of desperation. On the bridge, the crew moved as one. Some were veterans, eyes hollow but unshaken. Others were barely more than children, hands trembling as they pressed fire controls and sealed bulkheads. Every face bore the same expression: no retreat, no surrender. The alien flagship countered. Beams of starfire raked across the warship's hull, carving metal into molten rivers. Alarms wailed. Entire decks vented into the void. Yet the ship held, groaning, burning, and firing back. One by one, alien vessels fell. A frigate imploded in silence. A destroyer's spine snapped, scattering wreckage across the stars. Humanity's warship paid for every kill in blood. Entire gun crews were lost when compartments ruptured. Medics worked in smoke-choked corridors, stitching men and women who knew they would never see another sunrise. And still the ship howled. The survivors on the ground found themselves shouting, crying, pounding fists against the walls of bunkers. For the first time in years, the terror in their chests shifted. Fear was becoming fire. Children raised their heads. Soldiers clenched their rifles tighter. The howl was not just the warship's engines. It was theirs. But the enemy adapted. The alien fleet drew back, regrouped, and closed ranks. Hundreds of vessels formed a tightening sphere. The trap was set. No ship, no matter how furious, could break free. Inside the warship, the commander stood at the viewport. His face was scarred, his eyes bloodshot. He turned to his crew, voice steady, resolute. "This is not about survival," he said. "This is about legacy. Make them remember us." The engines roared louder, pushed beyond design, shaking bolts from the walls. Reactor gauges spiked into the red. The crew sealed themselves into compartments, knowing some doors would never open again. Pilots in battered strike craft launched into the storm, throwing themselves into the enemy lines. Each one a spark, each one a message. Humanity fights. Humanity burns. Humanity defies. The warship plunged into the heart of the alien formation. Guns blazed on every side. The void turned into a storm of light and fire. Fighters rammed cruisers. Plasma beams carved alien hulls in half. Entire squadrons were annihilated, but the swarm could not close fast enough. Deep in the reactor core, engineers worked with shaking hands. The commander's final order had been clear. If the ship could not survive, it would make the void remember. They rerouted coolant lines, overcharged capacitors, and primed the drive for one last howl. A detonation that could shatter an armada. Alien ships clawed closer. Boarding craft latched onto the hull. Breach alarms screamed. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the corridors. Humans with rifles, blades, even fists against armored monstrosities. Men and women fell, but they fell roaring. Defiance echoed in every corridor, every scream, every last breath. On the ground below, survivors watched the sky ignite. A child tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Is it winning?" she whispered. The mother's eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't matter," she said softly. "It's fighting." And then silence. The warship's engines dimmed for a single heartbeat. Alien vessels surged forward, sensing weakness. Cannons powered up for the killing strike. The void leaned close, ready to swallow hope once more. But in that silence, something shifted. Lights on the warship's hull flared white-hot. The commander's final words carried across every open frequency. Voice raw, defiant, unbroken. "Humanity kneels to no one." The reactor ignited. The explosion was not a burst. It was a birth, a star tearing itself open. Light roared across the void, shredding alien ships, burning their formations to ash. The howl of humanity became fire incarnate, a message carved into the fabric of the galaxy. When the light faded, wreckage drifted where once had been an armada. The warship was gone, nothing left but fragments glowing red in the silence. On the ground, survivors stepped into the dawn, their faces lit by embers still falling from the heavens. They wept, not for loss, but for pride. They had witnessed something the galaxy would never forget. And somewhere beyond the wreckage, beyond the silence, a single question lingered in every mind, alien and human alike. If this is what humanity does with one ship, what happens when the galaxy faces them all? If this gave you chills, share this story right now and subscribe, because humanity's fire is only beginning to burn. The battlefield was silent. No engines, no hymns, no alien chorus, only the slow drift of wreckage, shattered hulls, burning fragments, and the fading echoes of a warship that had howled itself into legend. On the ground, survivors stumbled into the open air. For days they had huddled in bunkers listening to the sky burn. Now they looked upward, eyes wide, searching for the shape that had saved them. It was gone. Nothing remained but glowing debris falling like a meteor shower across the dawn. Children asked where the warship had gone. Parents did not answer with lies. They spoke the truth. It fought, and it burned, and it saved us. And in their voices was not despair, but reverence. The warship had not vanished. It had become something larger than steel. The cost was carved into every face. Families mourned those who had not returned. Engineers who had primed the reactor. Pilots who had thrown themselves against impossible odds. Soldiers who had died in corridors filled with fire. All were gone. But their sacrifice was not silence. It was a declaration written in the ashes. Humanity kneels to no one. Word spread. Across fractured colonies, across broken stations, across every pocket where human life flickered, the message carried. Refugees whispered it around campfires. Resistance cells carved it into walls. Traitors who had once hidden their human origins now spoke with pride. The howl of the warship became more than an event. It became a myth. And the galaxy listened. Alien empires who had once dismissed humanity as fragile now studied the wreckage with unease. They counted the cost. A single human ship standing alone had crippled an armada. They whispered in their council halls, if one vessel could do this, what could a fleet accomplish? Fear began to creep where arrogance had lived. For humanity, the warship's end was not the end at all. It was the beginning. Survivors rebuilt with trembling hands, but their hearts carried fire. Children born in the shadow of the howl grew up knowing they belonged to a species that had stared into the void and screamed back. The galaxy had abandoned them, but they had not abandoned each other. The place of humanity had changed. They were no longer forgotten people clinging to the edges of the stars. They were a spark, burning too fiercely to be ignored. And as the first rebuilt transmitters crackled to life, carrying signals into the black, one message was repeated across every channel, every voice, every survivor who had seen the sky ignite. We are still here. The wreckage of the warship drifted on, cold and silent. But in the minds of billions it burned forever. A symbol, a warning, a promise. Because the galaxy now knew the truth. Humanity may break, humanity may bleed, but humanity will never bow. And if this is what we do when hope is gone, what will we become when hope returns? If this ending gave you goosebumps, subscribe and join the fire. Humanity's story is only just beginning.